Before this story ends, you will question justice, fear, belief, and silence, because what happened in Altamira, Brazil, was not only a crime but a wound that never closed. And in this documentary from Hidden Truth, we uncover how boys vanished, how bodies were found, mutilated, how power shaped truth, and how doubt still surrounds the answers. This story follows murdered children, shattered families, failed investigations, satanic ritual claims, false confessions, political pressure, judicial chaos, and a terrifying question about whether the real killer was ever punished. Stay with Hidden Truth until the end, because every chapter reveals something authorities never wanted connected. And if you value truth over comfort, subscribe, share, and press the bell icon now. Altamira was once a quiet municipality in the state of Para, Brazil, a place where children walked freely along dusty roads, where rivers defined daily life, and where families trusted neighbors without hesitation, until that sense of safety slowly collapsed between the late 1980s and early 1990s, when disappearances began to whisper through markets, schools, and churches, and fear settled into ordinary routines. The first reports did not sound like the beginning of a nightmare. They sounded like common worries. A child late to return, a boy who went to swim and did not come back, a family waiting past sunset believing everything would be fine. But days passed and hope weakened, and when bodies began to appear, the community realized something unnatural had entered their lives. Young boys between 8 and 14 years old vanished from ordinary moments, leaving homes to buy fruit, help with cattle, or play near rivers. And when some were found, they were naked, mutilated, and marked by extreme violence, creating terror, confusion, and a deep sense that innocence itself was being hunted. These discoveries were not only shocking, they were destabilizing, because the injuries suggested intent, patience, and ritual, and because the victims shared patterns, age, gender, and social vulnerability. And as rumors spread, people questioned who could commit such acts without being seen and why no one seemed able to stop it. Authorities at first treated each case separately, seeing them as tragic but unrelated crimes, and this fragmented approach delayed recognition of a larger pattern. And during this time, families were left without answers, without proper forensic care, and without reassurance that their children were safe. Bodies were recovered weeks after disappearances. Some burned, some beaten, some mutilated beyond recognition, and in several cases, autopsies were incomplete or never performed, leaving families without closure and investigators without scientific clarity as fear spread faster than facts across Altamira. By 1991, the name Altamira began appearing beyond regional news outlets, and the violence reached national attention, not because the crimes were solved, but because they seemed unstoppable and incomprehensible. And this attention added pressure to local authorities, who were now forced to explain what they could not yet understand. As fear intensified, schools adjusted schedules, parents escorted children everywhere, and ordinary interactions were replaced with suspicion because no clear suspect existed, and every unfamiliar face became a possible threat. And this psychological damage became one of the most enduring consequences of the case. The investigation was led by Civil Police Chief Eder Mauro, who faced an impossible task: limited resources, political pressure, public outrage, and a lack of forensic infrastructure. And early missteps would later haunt the credibility of every conclusion that followed. Witnesses offered fragmented stories, some sincere, some influenced by fear, others shaped by rumor and desperation, while investigators struggled to separate truth from panic. And every delay, every mistake, and every unanswered question widened the gap between justice and certainty. An early arrest brought temporary relief when a drifter named Rotilio de Souza was detained and presented as a suspect. And for a moment, people wanted to believe the nightmare had a simple explanation. But that hope collapsed when new crimes occurred with the same characteristics, proving the wrong person had been blamed. And when the suspect later died in custody under suspicious circumstances, distrust deepened further. This failure changed the tone of the investigation from routine policing to desperate theory building, and soon more extreme explanations began circulating, including organ trafficking, secret networks, and ritual motivations. And these theories gained traction, not because they were proven, but because nothing else explained the brutality. Families of victims demanded answers and accountability, and many felt abandoned by a system that could not even preserve evidence properly. And the absence of autopsies and scene analysis fueled accusations that the truth was being buried alongside the children. As months turned into years, Altamira lived under constant dread. Children were warned never to walk alone. Parents slept lightly, and a collective trauma formed where every unresolved disappearance felt like a reminder that the killer or killers were still free. This chapter of the story is not only about crimes committed against children. It is about a community pushed to the edge, where fear replaced trust, and where the demand for answers grew louder than the evidence available. And this imbalance would soon lead investigators toward a conclusion that would divide Brazil and leave lasting controversy. As fear tightened its grip on Altamira, the pressure on investigators intensified, and what began as an effort to understand the crimes gradually shifted into a race to calm public outrage, because every new disappearance deepened the sense that authorities were losing control and that failure would not be forgiven. Civil Police Chief Heitor Mauro faced a city demanding certainty while evidence remained fragile and incomplete, and early investigative decisions reflected urgency more than precision because cases were handled separately. Forensic standards were inconsistent, and critical time was lost in the earliest stages when patterns could have been identified. Instead of a unified task force, each crime moved through disconnected channels with missing documentation, delayed examinations, and witnesses interviewed without standardized procedures, allowing crucial links between victims' timelines and locations to slip through gaps that would later prove impossible to close. The arrest of Rotilio de Souza marked a turning point not because it solved the case, but because it revealed how badly the public wanted a face to blame and how quickly suspicion could replace proof. And when authorities presented him as a likely perpetrator, relief spread briefly through the city. That relief collapsed when new victims appeared bearing the same brutal characteristics, and the realization that an innocent man may have been imprisoned shook confidence further. And when Rotilio de Souza died in custody, under circumstances that were never fully explained, the case entered a darker phase, where mistrust of law enforcement became widespread. This moment transformed grief into anger. Families questioned whether investigators were protecting someone powerful or simply overwhelmed, and the idea that the wrong man had died while children continued to suffer became a wound that never healed within the community. With traditional investigative paths failing, more extreme theories began to dominate internal discussions and public conversations, and among them was the idea of an organized organ trafficking network, because mutilations appeared deliberate, and because similar rumors had surfaced in other regions of Brazil. Investigators examined whether medical knowledge had been involved, and attention turned toward two doctors who had recently moved to Altamira: Anício Ferreira de Souza and Cécio Brandão, and their arrival coinciding with the timeline of the crimes raised suspicion. Despite the absence of physical evidence, the theory suggested children were abducted for organ extraction. Yet forensic analysis later showed removed organs were unusable for transplantation, undermining the hypothesis and forcing investigators to confront the possibility that medical precision did not automatically imply medical motive. When the organ trafficking explanation weakened, investigators faced a dangerous vacuum, because without a clear theory, public trust was eroding, and political pressure intensified. And in that vacuum, the most controversial explanation emerged, one that would define the case for decades: the idea that the crimes were linked to occult rituals and satanic practices entered the investigation, not through forensic discovery, but through witness statements, rumors, and interpretations of religious literature. And in a deeply traumatized community, Such explanations felt emotionally satisfying even without material proof. Fear created fertile ground for belief, where coincidence became confirmation and symbolism replaced evidence, allowing investigators to frame chaos as conspiracy and brutality as ritual, giving structure to horror when science and procedure had failed. Witness testimony became the backbone of this new direction, despite inconsistencies, contradictions, and later recantations and statements were often influenced by suggestion, repeated questioning, and the psychological weight of a city desperate for meaning. As the narrative shifted, investigators focused less on reconstructing crime scenes and more on constructing a story that could explain everything at once, and this shift would have irreversible consequences, because once a theory hardens, evidence begins to serve it, rather than challenge it. The investigation now moved away from unknown predators toward named suspects linked by belief rather than proof, and this transition marked the moment when the case stopped searching for truth and began searching for closure, regardless of cost. By the time this phase ended, Altamira was no longer asking who committed the crimes but who would be punished, and that subtle shift changed justice from a process of discovery into an act of resolution shaped by fear, pressure, and unresolved pain. This chapter reveals how uncertainty, pressure, and collective trauma can distort investigations, and how the need for answers can become more powerful than the answers themselves, setting the stage for accusations that would shock Brazil and divide public opinion. As investigative pressure mounted and conventional explanations failed, the narrative surrounding the Altamira crimes shifted decisively toward a belief-driven conclusion, and this shift did not emerge from forensic breakthroughs or physical evidence, but from testimonies, interpretations, and fear-shaped logic that promised meaning where facts remained scarce. Investigators began focusing on an occult organization known as the Superior Universal Lineage, a group described as challenging traditional religious beliefs and expressing hostile views toward children and their role in society. And these ideas, when filtered through a traumatized community, quickly transformed suspicion into certainty. The SECT theory suggested the murders were ritual sacrifices guided by dark beliefs, where children were seen as instruments of a false god, and violence was framed as spiritual duty, giving investigators a narrative that explained brutality, intent, and repetition without requiring physical proof. This theory gained momentum through selective witness statements, including claims that rituals occurred behind closed doors, that chants were spoken, and that individuals linked to the sect were seen near crime scenes. Yet these statements often lacked consistency, timelines, and corroboration. Central to this narrative was Valentina de Andrade, the founder of the Superior Universal Lineage, whose writings included inflammatory language about children and divinity. And although her words were philosophical rather than instructional, they were interpreted as ideological motivation for murder. Authorities linked her past visits to Brazil and associations with individuals in Altamira as circumstantial evidence, and in a climate of panic, association alone became powerful enough to justify indictment. Religious texts were reinterpreted as confessions, metaphors were treated as instructions, and belief itself became evidence, allowing ideology to replace forensic science in the search for accountability. Two doctors, Anício Ferreira de Sousa and Cécio Brandão, became central suspects not because of physical links to crime scenes, but because of proximity, professional status, and perceived medical capability, and their roles as healers paradoxically made them more suspicious in a case defined by bodily harm. Witnesses claimed to have seen ritual objects, heard chants, and observed strange gatherings, yet these accounts frequently changed over time and were later contradicted by the same individuals under oath, raising serious concerns about reliability. Despite these issues, investigators pressed forward and framed the case as a coordinated conspiracy involving doctors, landowners, police officers, and spiritual leaders. And this framing offered the public a sense of order by suggesting the crimes were not random, but controlled and purposeful. The promise of a hidden network operating in shadows offered emotional relief because it replaced uncertainty with explanation, even as it abandoned the principles of evidence verification and procedural rigor. 7 individuals were indicted, based largely on testimony and inferred association, rather than material proof, and among them were members of law enforcement and influential families, which intensified public reaction and deepened divisions. The absence of autopsies, crime scene analysis, and forensic linkage was acknowledged but dismissed as secondary to witness accounts and moral certainty, and this prioritization reflected a system under siege, choosing narrative cohesion over investigative discipline. As legal proceedings advanced, inconsistencies multiplied, and witnesses recanted, contradicted themselves, or admitted coercion. Yet the momentum of accusation had grown too strong to reverse without consequence. Once the case entered the courtroom, belief hardened into institutional position, where doubt was treated as disloyalty, and questioning the theory was seen as defending evil, rather than seeking truth. Public demonstrations, political pressure, and media amplification created an environment where retreat became impossible, and even prosecutors who initially questioned the evidence faced backlash and personal risk. This chapter marks the point where the Altamira case ceased to be solely about murdered children and became a battle over belief, power, and narrative control, and where justice risked being defined not by truth, but by the need to conclude. When the case entered the judicial system, it carried more than evidence. It carried years of fear, grief, and expectation. And the courtroom became a place where the weight of unresolved trauma pressed against legal procedure, and where the desire for resolution often overshadowed the demand for proof. Brazilian law requires that crimes involving intentional killing be judged by a jury. But before that stage, the prosecution must survive an investigative phase designed to test the strength of evidence rather than the guilt of the accused. And in Altamira, this phase became one of the most controversial chapters of the entire case. Judge Orlando Arifano accepted the indictment and initiated hearings that relied heavily on witness testimony and circumstantial narratives. And from the beginning, the process showed signs of imbalance, because the absence of forensic evidence forced the court to lean on statements shaped by time pressure and emotional strain. The courtroom filled with expectation. Families demanded justice, activists demanded punishment, and the accused stood surrounded by suspicion where belief had already formed conclusions before testimony even began, transforming legal procedure into a public ritual of judgment. Among the most significant witnesses was Edmilson da Silva Frazão, whose statements described participation in alleged satanic rituals and direct involvement of key defendants, and his testimony became a cornerstone of the prosecution. Despite inconsistencies regarding dates, locations, and specific actions, as hearings progressed, contradictions emerged. And when pressed, Edmilson struggled to maintain a coherent timeline, sometimes placing events in different years and altering details. Yet his narrative remained influential because it supported the dominant theory and reinforced public belief. At one point, even the chief prosecutor, Roberto Pinho, expressed concern and moved to dismiss the charges, citing lack of evidence. But this decision triggered immediate backlash and public outrage, and revealed how deeply the case had moved beyond legal boundaries into the realm of social pressure. The moment a prosecutor questioned the case, he became a target of hostility. Protests erupted. Symbolic acts were staged, and fear replaced debate, demonstrating how the pursuit of justice had been overtaken by the need to protect a narrative that could not be allowed to collapse under pressure. Another prosecutor challenged the dismissal and summoned Edmilson again, and despite clear contradictions, the judge found the testimony satisfactory and moved forward, pronouncing the accused guilty. In the investigative phase, against prosecutorial advice, defense attorneys appealed, arguing that the decision ignored procedural safeguards and relied on unreliable testimony, and the appeal briefly succeeded when higher court officials acknowledged the absence of evidence and overturned parts of the decision. This moment exposed the fragile foundation of the case, yet instead of prompting reconsideration, it ignited public fury, and demonstrations intensified, and judicial independence was tested as judges faced threats and social pressure rarely seen in modern Brazilian legal history. Fear now operated on both sides. Families feared losing justice, judges feared public retaliation, and the accused feared conviction based on belief rather than proof, creating an environment where law struggled to function as law. The case was reopened multiple times and moved between magistrates, each bringing different interpretations and procedural approaches, and this instability prolonged the suffering of families and defendants alike, while further eroding confidence in the system. In a dramatic turn, Edmilson da Silva Frazão recanted his testimony, claiming he had been pressured, and later returned to reaffirm parts of it, while alleging coercion from unnamed individuals. And this reversal highlighted the dangers of relying on testimony. Born in fear, defense lawyers appealed to the federal Supreme Court, arguing judicial bias and violation of the right to defense, and the court acknowledged irregularities and ordered new hearings, effectively nullifying prior convictions and reopening the investigative phase. This decision did not declare innocence, nor did it deliver justice. Instead, it confirmed that the process itself had been compromised, and that the truth had been buried beneath fear, pressure, and procedural failure. Eventually, defendants who had spent years in detention were released, including Cécio Brandão, who later declared his intention to sue the state, claiming he had been used as a scapegoat to mask investigative flaws. The courtroom phase of the Altamira case revealed a painful truth: that when society demands answers faster than evidence can provide them, justice becomes vulnerable and courts risk becoming arenas where belief replaces law. This chapter shows how the legal system struggled not only with facts but with fear, and how the pursuit of closure nearly destroyed the very principles meant to protect truth and rights. Years after Altamira had been marked by fear, court battles, and unresolved grief, a new shock emerged from another region of Brazil when a man named Francisco das Chagas Rodrigues de Brito was arrested in the state of Maranhão and confessed to dozens of crimes against children. And among those confessions were killings that matched the timeline and brutality of the Altamira cases. Francisco das Chagas described patterns of abduction, assault, and murder that echoed what families in Altamira had lived through, and he claimed responsibility for more than 40 crimes, including 12 linked to Altamira. And this confession reignited pain, hope, and anger, because it suggested that while courts focused on belief the real killer may have remained free. The confession described luring boys from public places, isolating them, inflicting extreme violence, and leaving bodies hidden in rural areas, details that mirrored disappearances in Altamira, and forced investigators and families to confront the terrifying possibility that justice had followed the wrong path for years. Authorities now faced an uncomfortable question: whether the long prosecution of alleged SECT members had diverted attention from a serial offender operating across state lines, and whether institutional momentum had prevented course correction when warning signs appeared despite the gravity of the confession. Its legal impact was limited because previous cases were already entangled in complex judicial histories, and reopening them required acknowledging procedural failures that few institutions were willing to confront openly. Families of the accused renewed their calls for reinvestigation, arguing that the confession validated their claims of innocence and demonstrated that belief-driven prosecution had caused irreversible harm. And families of victims were divided between those seeking new truth and those fearing endless uncertainty for the families. This moment reopened every wound, because a confession did not erase loss, but instead raised unbearable questions about whether years of pain could have been avoided, and whether the system that promised justice had instead multiplied suffering. Legal experts debated whether the confession met evidentiary standards for retrial, and whether statute limitations and procedural barriers would block accountability. and this debate unfolded publicly, reinforcing the sense that the case was never truly resolved. The state eventually acknowledged partial responsibility by granting pensions to some surviving victims, recognizing institutional failure without fully admitting error, and this gesture, while important, could not replace answers nor restore trust. Altamira itself continued to live with the legacy of the crimes as survivors carried physical and psychological scars, and families navigated a collective memory shaped by fear, rumor, and unresolved truth, and the city became a symbol of how violence can outlast legal decisions. What remained was not a clear verdict, but a cautionary lesson about how fear can shape investigations. Belief can replace evidence, and institutions under pressure can choose certainty over truth, leaving justice incomplete and wounds unhealed. The Altamira case now stands as one of the most controversial criminal episodes in Brazilian history, studied by academics, journalists, and human rights advocates as an example of systemic failure and the dangers of moral panic. It reminds us that justice is not only about punishment, but about process, and that when process collapses, truth becomes fragile, and communities suffer long after headlines fade. This story matters because it asks whether justice served without truth is justice at all, and whether societies are willing to admit error when admitting error threatens authority, power, and collective comfort. Altamira teaches that protecting children requires more than outrage. It requires patience, rigor, and humility, and that without these, even the pursuit of justice can cause harm. This chapter closes not with certainty, but with responsibility. The responsibility to remember, to question, and to demand better systems that value truth over narrative and evidence over fear. What happened in Altamira was never just a sequence of crimes. It became a mirror reflecting how fear, pressure, belief, and institutional failure can reshape reality and leave everyone wounded: victims, families, the accused, investigators, and an entire nation that still struggles with unanswered questions. This story was built from documented investigations, court records, academic studies, survivor testimonies, and journalism that spans decades, and it exists because the truth, even when uncomfortable, refuses to disappear. Altamira reminds us that justice without evidence becomes belief. Evidence without courage is ignored, and belief without accountability can destroy lives while claiming to protect them. The children whose names are remembered and those who vanished without answers deserve more than closure. They deserve honesty, rigor, and systems strong enough to admit error and brave enough to correct it. If stories like this matter to you, if you believe that truth deserves patience and that silence protects no one, then this is your place. References of this story: Wikipedia, Altamira Child Emasculations, Folha de São Paulo, Investigative Reports on the Altamira Case, Globo News, long-form investigative coverage, Federal University of Para academic research papers, Brazilian Supreme Federal Court judicial records, Human Rights Commission of the Brazilian Chamber of Deputies reports Estadão and UOL Notícias journalistic archives, anthropology and human rights academic publications on the Altamira case. Thank you for staying until the end. And remember, the truth only survives when people demand it. Subscribe, share, and press the bell icon on Hidden Truth. Because every story we tell is chosen to challenge comfort, question power, and keep forgotten voices alive. Hidden Truth exists, so these stories are never buried again.